We now headed for the St Lawrence Seaway, which opened in 1959 as a joint venture between the Canadian and US governments. Navigation markers were now jumbo-sized, catering as they did for large commercial shipping. We passed under the high-level Thousand Islands Bridge, which connects the US state of New York to the Canadian province of Ontario. This area is known as the Thousand Islands, although the actual number is closer to 1,800. Many are privately owned, and some are home to a single magnificent house or castle. This is Bolt Castle on Hart Island, and the ship passing in front of it is one of the purpose-built lakers, which can best be visualized by imagining a ship half the width and twice the length of a football field. The Canadian-controlled Iroquois lock was the first of 6 we encountered along the St Lawrence Seaway. This is a flood control lock with a change in level of less than 2 feet, so we did not even need to tie up to the lock walls. After this first lock, we hoisted our faded Canadian courtesy flag and headed for the Chrysler Park Marina on the Canadian side of the border, where we officially entered Canada. The following day we passed through the American-run Eisenhower and Snell locks, which are adjacent to each other. This pair of locks had ingenious floating bollards set into deep slots in the lock walls, so it was only necessary to loop short lines around them. These 2 locks together lowered us 80 feet. We paid $60 for the 2, with cash placed in a box tendered to us at the end of a long pole. The rapidly dropping water level revealed a battered wooden fender at the base of the lock gates. Its function became apparent as we watched the laker enter the lock we had just vacated, with only inches to spare on either side. She had to use considerable power to force her way into the chamber in order to displace the water trapped ahead of her. We spent that night tied up in the Valleyfield Marina, where a charming French-Canadian couple drove us to the local market in their car. Everyone we met in French Canada was extremely helpful and friendly. The next day we followed the Canadian Beaumanoir Canal, which had 2 vertical lift bridges carrying rail lines across the river. The lift sections are quite narrow, and from the perspective of a long ship must seem like threading a needle, bearing in mind the strong currents. At the downstream end of the Beaumanoir Canal are a pair of Canadian-run locks with the same name. Here we had a short wait while the laker of Vosburg passed through the lock. Commercial traffic has priority over pleasure craft, and we had been warned we might have to wait as long as 4 hours at each lock, but the longest we had to wait was only 10 minutes. We often had a lock to ourselves, which was a sobering thought, considering that each lock discharges 24 million gallons of water per transit. Our last lock was the St Lambert lock, where the situation was complicated, with 2 rail lines and a road crossing the lock area. Solid hardware is important for safe line handling, with closed chocks and large cleats. After leaving the lock, we had to make a U-turn around the tip of Ile Sainte-Hélène and proceed upstream under Jacques Cartier Bridge. We now faced the full force of the mighty river for the first time, and the current was running at 7 knots. For Venture, this presented no problem, with her twin screws and ample power. We were allocated a good slip in the Marina Port d'Escale. Horse-drawn fiacs plodded up and down the crowded streets of the old town, which is very French in character, while buskers and street performers kept the crowds entertained. Colourful stalls lined the waterfront. Artists offered portraits and instant caricatures of passers-by. We spent 2 nights in Montreal before continuing our journey downriver. We were soon back in the grip of the fierce current. Along with the Lakers, we now began to see conventional freighters for the first time since leaving the Hudson. We stopped for the night at Trois-Rivières, so called because here the St Lawrence River splits into 3 channels. The tidal range in Trois-Rivières is 3 feet, but in Quebec, 67 miles downstream, it can reach as much as 18 feet. The speed of the current was very apparent from the rate at which the navigation markers appeared to be ploughing through the water, some of them well battered either by ice or being struck by passing traffic. Vessels making their way upstream had to fight their way against the current. The landscape on both banks was both rural and scenic, with church spires a prominent feature in almost every town. 2 impressive bridges marked the approaches into Quebec, and here the river and channel narrow with consequent increase in current. High bluffs on the port side, crowned by the ancient citadel, mark the location of the battle in 1759 between the British and the French, which changed the history of this part of Canada. The entrance to the old port of Quebec lies downstream of this point, just before a prominent line of massive grain silos. The current sweeping past the narrow entrance meant it had to be entered with resolve, and because of the tidal range, it was still necessary to pass through a lock to reach the inner basin. We waited in the outer basin along with 8 other yachts. It did not seem possible that there would be room, but they packed us all in. Quebec was celebrating its 400th anniversary, and we stayed here for 1 week, moored in the old port in the heart of this delightful city.